Welcome, everyone, to JBN's Strategy That Works podcast. My name is Brian Betkowski. I'm here in our studio with my friend and colleague, Rob Amberg. We're your hosts today. We've got a fun topic, a topic that's been around for a while, probably since the beginning of business time, and that's mergers and acquisitions, M&A. But we're going to take a little different spin on it today. You know, the traditional context of mergers and acquisitions is combining companies for scale, or the consulting buzzword of synergies. We're going to take a little bit of different take on that. Is instead of, perhaps just combining companies, what if it was the focus of M&A was curating companies, not just combining, but curating over the next 10 years, the next chapter in the M&A world. And, access, influence, positioning, all those different ways of looking at that. We've got a fun guest too that will explore this with. But before we do, you can put it into context, objectively, quantitatively for us before we jump into this.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Brian. When we look at global M&A deal volume last year, it rose a little more than 12% to a little over $3.5 trillion. And so what that tells us is deal making is very much still alive and active, but it's also changing shape. And the average deal size last year was a little over $440 million. And those deals that are kind of considered mid-sized, between 1 and 10 billion, they made up 46% of all total deal value. So that's really a sign that what we're seeing is more of those modular string of pearl type acquisitions rather than the traditional M&A blockbuster deals. And so when we hear from corporate leaders, there's a recent study done that 90% of them have shifted their targeting strategy. You mentioned position, and really over the last 2 years, they've started to shift their position and what they're looking for, and it really goes to those companies that are not just looking for scale or cost savings, but that positioning. And so the analogy that we like to use from a chess analogy is controlling the board versus owning the pieces. And so really kind of a fascinating time to be in M&A.
Yeah. I mean, the whole platform play, that concept's been around for a little while. And that's what we're going to explore today is what's maybe the next evolution of that. Is it more of an ecosystem? That's what we're going to have fun with today. And so we've got a really good fun guest. I'm happy to welcome. Not only is he the lead of JBN's Chicago office, he's a shareholder as well in the firm, and he leads our mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures service area. So welcome, Dan Hickey, to the show today.
Thanks, Brian. I'm excited to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
All right. Let's jump into it, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. While we were kind of prepping for this and having some conversations, you'd mentioned that, when looking at kind of the future of deals, that the next decade of deals will be about building position and not possession. And so kind of at that 100,000 foot level, can you talk about what that really means and what that means in practice?
Yeah, you guys touched on it a little bit too, but I mean, to me, I think the next decade of deals looks a lot less like transactions in the classic sense, and a lot more kind of like building ecosystems, the term that's used, Brian. M&A traditionally has been about combining businesses, and you combine businesses for kind of a handful of purposes: top line growth, scale, pure cost synergies, things like that. And I think it's moving more towards the idea of convergence, where companies are using deals more to connect than just combined. And when I say connect, it's connecting on things like capabilities and data, connecting on customer reach and market access, things like that. Traditionally, you'd look to like industries or like business models for M&A activity, and now I think that's a lot less important than it used to be. It's no longer just about owning assets and managing portfolios of independent businesses, but use that term influence. I think it's around orchestrating influence and building systems to kind of shape markets as opposed to just participating in them. And along with kind of the platform play evolving, for a while it was just pure financial engineering, and I think the winners are going to be less focused on financial engineering now and more focused on building something bigger and better than what either organization could have done on their own through simple, linear growth or maturing as a business.
Are there certain industries that you're seeing lead this new era, or is it mostly strategics or private equity that's leading this? Where are you seeing the leaders?
Well, I mean, tech has always kind of been at the forefront of these types of deals. Where I think you're seeing a lot of activity now is more cross industry. So that's kind of part of that convergence play. But you see a large, major online retailer buying a healthcare company, and they're buying them for a few reasons. One, because you're getting access to another very high growth sector, but they're realizing ways that they can use their comparative advantages around data, around logistics, and things like that to amplify the growth of a healthcare business that not from their sector at all, but there's certain capabilities that they bring that can really help both companies. So data is a big one. People are buying companies simply for the data, both because they then have access to the data, but they're also figuring out how to monetize that.
Are you seeing consistencies across size? Is this more trends for smaller deals, medium, large, all?
Yeah, I think it's all size deals.
Yeah.
And how much of the kind of geopolitical play has influenced that from companies? You mentioned buying influence. So much is tied to both like regulations and whether it's tariffs big in the news now, but like if you have a footprint or if you have an acquisition that's in a foreign country that gives you maybe more influence, how much is that at play?
Yeah, no, I definitely think you're seeing a lot of that as well. If there's regulatory hurdles from a business in one country, buying a company that gives you access to a different regulatory environment as opposed to trying to enter that market is absolutely one of the reasons that people are looking to do deals globally.
Absolutely.
Continuing on the just the things in the news. Obviously, you mentioned technology. Obviously, AI is a huge topic these days. Talk to us about how you're seeing either AI or automation or other kind of advanced technologies playing in the M&A space.
Well, I think it's helping people get a lot smarter about the different types of deals they can do. So I'm seeing a lot of companies use it in their M&A strategies and in their target screening to think about new and creative ways to build these ecosystems. I'm seeing companies use it a lot to accelerate diligence. For sure, there's lots of data that you can now process much more efficiently, much more quickly and precisely through use of AI. And then we're using it a lot on integrations and helping bring companies together based on the volume of data and the large language models to kind of help plan for and execute integrations.
Talk to us about maybe some real world examples. You're mentioning some things you've been seeing. Give us some. I mean, obviously you can't share everything, but maybe talk about that in a real world way, so our listeners can get some ideas about what they can be thinking about.
So like talking about building platforms, one major global tech player buying a handful of different types of businesses, for example. So you might buy, a global technology player buying a social network and an online platform for developers as well as a video game company. That doesn't just give them new access to all these customers, but it allows them to influence, how those industries evolve. So now all sorts of new industries and customers are using the infrastructure, the technology, and the cloud computing power that that you've got.
Yeah, I think interestingly, kind of buying those with markets or customers from a cross sell standpoint, it's no longer just about the kind of you mentioned the bottom line dollars and cents. It's really moved. Do you think the future, like when we think about a deal desk and who's putting together the deals, do you see that moving from more pure nuts and bolts financial folks to kind of a mix of that strategist, diplomat, and intelligence analyst, just taking all these factors into mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about the next generation of deals and the next generation of deal makers. I think the next generation of deal maker looks a lot less like a traditional banker or private equity executive and a lot more like an architect and somebody who's putting a lot of big pieces together in new and complex ways to design something, bigger and different than it's ever been thought about before, for sure.
I think interesting. That could open up a whole new career path. It's like a deal architect. Certainly not what it was 10 years ago. It's kind of exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think corporate strategy is playing a much more pertinent role with the traditional, M&A corp dev teams. I think they used to be connected but separate, and I think now increasingly those two functions are necessarily integrated as the deals become so much more complex, and the thesis behind them becomes a lot more complex as well.
Yeah. If you were, when you are, and if you were in the future again, to, advising someone leading a deal team, let's just say in a corporation, not in private equity, what are the top things that you're advising them on or telling them to look out for? What are the topics that you're talking about with them most often?
Well, I mean, we start at the kind of the far end of the early part of the deal cycle about your strategy and being clear on what your M&A strategy is and the thesis behind it. For so long, especially throughout the tech boom, and then again in the last 7 or 8 years, you saw mostly tech companies just buying up whatever they could, right, and then never actually getting the value out of them and realizing the synergy, never kind of realizing the value from cross-selling, upselling, or building a code that was, delivering on the platform that might have been the thesis behind those deals. So, we're advising clients to be very clear on what their strategy is and what their thesis is and why, and then it allows you to become a lot more disciplined in the pipeline management and what companies you're targeting, what companies you're prioritizing, and how you work them through your M&A pipeline. So, it used to be a lot more around getting the LOI signed and getting the deal closed and integrating it. And now I think there's got to be much more work and deliberation done up front on what your strategy is and how you're going about looking for and finding your deals.
Yeah, we had an interesting podcast recently. We were talking about the people implications. In this case, it was AI. I'd love to hear your take on, what is the knowledge base, the knowledge worker's role in an upcoming world where, knowledge, it's questionable if knowledge is even an asset anymore because everyone has access to lots of knowledge. What's the new asset that is that's the differentiating asset? If perhaps, I'm not saying that knowledge has no value, but perhaps if it's less of a differentiator, what's the differentiator in the next chapter?
Well, I think the differentiator is not just the knowledge, but how you access and how you use the knowledge, right? I think there's people still figuring out the value and how to get the value out of AI and these types of platforms. But I think the people that are harnessing that and institutionalizing how you go about, gathering and using the knowledge is super important.
I think it's kind of interesting what you said before about M&A as a tool for influence and the role of the corporate strategy. It needs to be aligned around that, and it seems to me that it just opens up maybe a new avenue for who's going to have the most influence making those decisions, right? And you have a corporate strategy that says X, but if that can be influenced through acquisition, I think it just opens the aperture on opportunities and potential for how you can achieve that strategy in a new and exciting way. Where if you had never thought about, if you're a candy company and you've never thought about buying a video game company, as an example, hypothetically, there's just a lot of new avenues where if you have that outside strategic mindset through this M&A lens, I think it's an exciting time to be in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing that was kind of get back to what I was talking about, where you're buying a capability. So if you're selling candy, you don't want to start manufacturing candy in a new country because of the costs of doing so and entering that market and branding and all that are too high. You might buy another type of manufacturer who's got a great supply chain and distribution network established already in there. So you might buy that company simply for their supply chain and distribution capabilities. Then you can start selling your candy through those and enter a market kind of through that back door there. So I think you're seeing a lot of creativity around buying companies for specific capabilities that give you access to new markets and to new customers.
And I think a lot of that is, we're talking about like the offense. What in terms of defense, can companies be doing the same thing where they're buying up supply chains of companies that dominate supply chains of competitors or suppliers of competitors as a stopgap?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that gets back to the point you made around not necessarily owning the pieces, but controlling the board. So you're now kind of setting the systems and the rules and the guardrails for the market, as opposed to just being a competitor or a participant in that market, for sure.
Something you were saying a second ago made me think about the JV joint venture world, where that's a component or an aspect of the M&A space. Are you seeing any changes there? How does that play into strategy?
Yeah, I think there's this kind of concept that you're hearing more about time-bound M&A too, right? And in the times of increased volatility, like we're seeing now, optionality becomes that much more valuable and that much more important. So I think you're seeing a lot of joint ventures and co-investments and things like that might have a time frame for what that partnership or what that deal looks like. Think about, industries where the technology is changing rapidly and the regulation and regulatory environment is changing rapidly. Think something like energy and clean tech. That's all moving so quickly that you might not want to buy a company that's growing in that space now. You might want options in that company. You might want to go into a joint venture with that company, and then in 5 years, through some kind of options or warrants, you've got a natural off ramp built in, so you're not stuck with something if it's obsolete by the time you get to the end of that time horizon.
Speaking of time horizons, it's so interesting. Like, just think of the pace of change right now, and not only just with the new technologies like AI and other things, but just seems like, the political environment changes fast. Everything changes so fast. What are you seeing about people's time horizons? I know that's different based off of, your thesis, or whether you're in, private equity or a strategic buyer, but what are you seeing on time horizons and how people are thinking about that?
Well, I think, it's interesting because I think for a while their deal volume was slowing down, and I think people were waiting for everything to kind of calm back down a bit. And I think the simple reality is that it hasn't necessarily calmed down. So chaos being the new normal, people still had, money they needed to put to work. There's $2.5 trillion of private equity dry powder waiting to be put to work. And I think there's, traditional funds that are still going to have their classic horizon, 2, 3, 5 years, whatever it is. But I think you're seeing a lot more like family offices come to prominence in doing deals, who've got a very different thesis and a very different time horizon. So I think as a lot of these family offices and really wealthy families play more and more in this space, they're going to be an attractive buyer to a lot of sellers, because it's a lot more typically of the buy and hold and a longer, almost infinite time horizon for the deals that they're doing.
It's interesting. We've been talking a lot about buying and the buyer's perspective. Talk to us a little bit about the other side of the coin. If we have a listener out there that's thinking about, positioning their firm for acquisition, or their company to be acquired, what are some of the things that they should be thinking now that are different from perhaps years ago?
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of clients contacting us over the last, call it 6 months or so, about divestitures and getting ready to sell either their entire business or pieces of their business. And I think, the thought process is similar to what we're talking about, is what pieces of your business no longer serve the larger system that you're trying to be the curator of, and what, where is your growth no longer what business units is the growth no longer contributing to your overall thesis of the system you're trying to put together. And there's a pretty good chance that there's a buyer out there who is looking for that piece. So I think people are seeing pretty good valuations for business units that they don't value nearly as high, because they've gotten the growth out of, because their thesis has changed, because their strategy has changed. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of activity in the divestitures of the coming years.
With the 46% of the deals, I think we mentioned, being in kind of those mid-size between 1 and 10 billion, and the smaller deals around 25 million. I think we're up 8% last year. Is that indicative to you at all, or are you seeing that maybe people are taking it with respect to the pace of change, kind of a toe in the water, or let's do a smaller, safer deal and prove that it works, rather than jumping in something larger that might have more stickiness?
No, I don't know that I've necessarily seen any trends there. I'm sure there's companies at all sort of ends of that spectrum, but most of the clients I'm been working with on deals lately have had a more crystal clear view of what their M&A strategy is, and they're not changing it based on the markets, necessarily. They might be more selective about their deals, but I think, most people, like I talked about earlier, have gotten a lot more clear kind of on what their strategy is and what their thesis is and the types of companies they're going after.
Good. Any topics that perhaps we haven't hit on that are top of your mind or top of your clients' minds that we should be talking about?
I think one of the interesting things around, talk about how there's all the stats out there about how such a high percentage of M&A activity never achieves kind of the ROI that was contemplated. I think in this concept of M&A being more about control and influence, it's going to be really interesting to see, because I think that's a lot tougher to measure than pure ROI about what are our gains and what are our growth based on what we invested. So I think that's something that deal makers, consultants, bankers alike, what we're all going to have to figure out is how do we actually truly measure the value of the deals that we've done going forward, because I think it's just a very different model. So I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that plays out.
Your point about how M&A obviously has financial value that you're hoping for, but how it can be just such an interesting part of your strategy, long-term or short-term strategy, and that it's not always a direct correlation to dollars and cents maybe in the near term, but in the long term, it should enable the strategy. It's interesting.
Absolutely.
Well, good. Any questions on anybody's mind?
No, it's been really, really insightful, Dan.
Yeah, Dan, I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Look forward to doing it again soon.
Absolutely. Enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you.
You bet.